That's vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin in 2008. But the current administration is less keen on that, and they've also said no to that Keystone pipeline, which would have brought more Canadian oil to America. They say they just want to protect our environment. Governor Palin joins us now. You've called their attitude terrifyingly naive.
Yes, our president really is clueless when it comes to the need for an energy policy. He really doesn't have an energy policy for America except to kowtow to foreign dangerous regimes, asking them to produce energy that we have here underfoot. Not only in Alaska, which is so resource rich, but in the Dakotas, in Pennsylvania, in Texas, California, Louisiana offshore. God has just dumped this cornucopia full of resources underfoot, and it just takes political will to tap into them.
The environmentalists claim about, say, the Keystone pipeline. It would transport raw, toxic tar sand oil right through the American heartland, would wreak environmental havoc. And they got protesters to join them in protesting that.
I wonder if they realize that our nation is woven together with pipelines. I don't think that the environmentalists are sane and sound at all with this argument against Keystone, which would produce and flow about 700,000 barrels of oil, safe, friendly oil into our market. It makes absolutely no sense that this one particular issue that they've just gotten so wee-weed up about. John, what it's all about is fundraising for the environmentalists. It's just like, oh, can't open ANWR, though no good sound reason for not opening ANWR, a tiny little pinprick that's needed up there in a corner of Alaska to explore for more oil and gas, except that it's kind of like a poster child for the environmentalists' fundraising efforts. Keystone has become that.
All right, we'll get to ANWR in a moment. Let's do more in Keystone. The activists basically won. They got the protesters out. We're showing video now of people yelling, "Stop the pipeline. Yes, we can." And tar executives, not this earth. You say it's clean oil, but it is tar. It's gross oil if it did spill, and it could spill. Another group said it could cause a BP-like oil spill in America's heartland, the source of fresh drinking water for 2 billion people. It sounds terrifying to people.
Onshore drilling is much safer than the deep offshore drilling that has been seen in the news relatively lately. So this should be something that environmentalists could embrace as opposed to having to force more offshore oil exploration and developments if they're not going to allow us the safe onshore drilling. And John, America has the highest standards in the world when it comes to environmental protection.
When the mainstream media, or the lamestream media, as I like the way you put it, talk about Keystone, they showed this map. And they implied that this giant, gross pipeline would pollute pristine, clean America. The media, though, rarely showed this map, which shows how many pipelines already exist in America. You think media bias is part of the problem?
A tiny bit of liberal media bias and that base of President Obama's, the environmental fundraisers that dump money into, so traditionally anyway, leftist politicians.
Now, you're famous for your drill, baby, drill line. President Bush opened up the east and west coast to drilling, but before it could really happen, President Obama shut that down.
The president has been dishonest with the American public about what he has allowed, if you will, the drilling that is taking place. Not only did President Bush tee up the drilling that we see going on now, but President Obama taking credit for private sector and state land allowance of drilling is it's quite disingenuous because the president doesn't have control over that aspect of the energy industry. What he does have control over is federal lands, and yet he has locked those up.
If we drilled more, earlier in the show, one of my guests said, wouldn't make that much difference, maybe 1% to the price of gas.
We've been hearing that for how many years? We've been hearing that we shouldn't tap into ANWR because, shoot, it'll only produce, some say, 10 years worth of energy security and independence for America. Well, then we should have done it 10 years ago. And heck, even if it was just 1%, my goodness, isn't that better than nothing? That 1% will allow trade imbalances to kind of even out. It will allow hundreds of thousands of jobs to be created if we were drilling everywhere, as that pundit had claimed that we perhaps could be. Well, we should be. We have more oil here than anything that we would ever have to look to import from these foreign countries, if only, again, we had the political will to tap into it.
Let's close then by talking about some of that oil, ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Now, maybe you could explain this to me, because I don't know Alaska geography, but it's the size of South Carolina by itself. Drilling there is off limits now, but the drilling footprint, if they drilled, would be small, like laying a 3-foot welcome mat on a basketball court?
Or a postage stamp on a football field. That's the equivalent of the thumbprint that is needed for that drilling, especially with new technology and the directional drilling allowing.
Because the drill goes in and goes sideways.
Right. So Alaska is hundreds of millions of acres. It's huge. I mean, it's 2.5 times the state of Texas. We're asking for 2,000 acres, and that's it. It's about the size of LAX, a typical big city airport, that size of a parcel to allow the oil companies to be on there drilling for the oil, tapping into it, and then, John, flowing it into the existing Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline, the 800-mile pipeline that used to produce about 25% of the U.S. domestic supply of energy. Now it's way, way down. We went from about 2 million barrels a day now to about 700,000 barrels a day. It needs to be full. Environmentally and engineering-wise, it flows oil better the fuller it is. It makes no sense that we can't tap the resources
But what
up
if
there.
something breaks and it'll just destroy this pristine environment?
What has broken in the last 30-some years in that Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline? Nothing, except one crazy dude once who shot a gun and poked a hole in the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline. I don't want erosion of that infrastructure. I don't want that atrophy of the pipeline. I want to make sure that oil companies are adhering to the lease agreements that they make with the owners of the resource. And Charles Payne, love him, but he's wrong. It's not a socialist view here when we recognize that in Alaska, read our Constitution, the oil reserves underground are owned commonly. Not one person or one family or one business owns any of the oil. It is owned in common. And that's why, as a governor, sometimes, people wanted to run me out of town saying, you're too tough on the oil companies. And I'm saying, hey, the oil is owned collectively, and I'm working for the people of Alaska. We got to make sure that there is integrity, both engineering-wise, ethical legislation, vote buying, and all the kind of stuff that sometimes you hear about in politics that becomes corrupt. I oversaw all that, John, and I made sure that the oil companies were adhering to the leases in their agreement. And, that's what it took. Exxon finally, they got their drill rigs out there, they hired the guys, and they're up there. We finally see some action.
Thank you, Governor Palin.
Thank you.
Coming up, more